I'm Steve Lascalzo, and this is The Way.
This is the way.
This is the way. This is the way. This is the way. This is the way.
Thank you for joining me for a special edition of This is the Way podcast. It's our annual Star Wars Podcast Day episode. What is Star Wars Podcast Day? Daniel of the Star Wars Now This Is Podcasting site reached out a few years ago to some Star Wars podcasters with an idea. Well, you've heard of Star Wars Day probably, May the 4th. We celebrate that too, but Daniel C's idea was, let's honor those who took the extra step from Star Wars fandom into actually making media. The idea was to have Star Wars Podcast Day as a remembrance of Jedi talk. Daniel recognizes that as the first Star Wars-centered podcast. It premiered on February 7th in 1999. That marks the 26th anniversary of Jedi Talk and the 5th Star Wars Podcast Day here in 2025. You can see the hashtag Star Wars Podcast Day 2025, SWPD 2025. There are social media accounts at Star Wars Pod Day and an email address, starwarspodday@gmail.com. Last year, there were more than 100 shows taking part, and it looks like there will be more than 100 taking part in 2025 as well.
This is the way.
This is the way. This is the way.
The first few years of this podcast's participation, we didn't create a special episode. We simply timed out an episode to post on the 7th. In 2020, that was the beginnings of a global pandemic, and our episode was delayed until later in the month, if you even count that. The last couple years, though, I've done something extra. 2 years ago, I interviewed a lifelong friend about growing up as a fellow Star Wars fan. Then in 2024, I spoke candidly about my own Star Wars fandom, stepping into podcasting. And this year, I'm going to talk the timeline of Star Wars. A friend named Holly J recently had some questions for me about Skeleton Crew. She asked, well, when is this supposed to take place? When are the events of the show taking place in Star Wars? And I know, it can be hard because unless it says right there in the show, how are you supposed to know? This is the kind of thing I check out and I research. But if you're not covering the shows and you're not reading all the articles, you just want to watch the show for entertainment, how would you know? There wasn't a crawl or a date that showed up on the screen. So unless there is a context clue or unless you seek it out, you may not know when the show you're watching takes place in relation to the movies or the other shows that have already been produced, and you might not know if it's before or after some of the shows that are yet to come. This is not a specifically what's canon podcast. I do think it's important to note I'm not going to cover novels or comics or the show Young Jedi Adventures, things like that, but this is just shows and movies that appear right now on Disney+. Doesn't mean they were produced for Disney+. Some of them, like Rebels, came before. But we're going to talk mostly live action. There are a few I feel need to be mentioned, like Rebels, The Bad Batch, the Clone Wars animated series in the movie, not the Tartarovsky Clone Wars. And this is not a value judgment show either. Sometimes it is, I guess, but you have to stop somewhere. So I'm not including everything. So Holly, here you go. I should also point out, I spent a lot of time trying to make graphics to include in the video version of the podcast. I spent more time doing that than I do speaking about it. But now let's talk about the timeline of Star Wars.
May the Force be with you.
And also with you.
I get a lot of questions about what order to watch the movies in. I think that's probably common to a lot of Star Wars fans, especially if it's the first time you're talking to somebody about Star Wars. What order do you watch them in? Well, Marvel has a guideline on Disney Plus for the chronological watch order for the movies. It includes things from Phase 1 through 3, and then there are a lot of things that come after Phase 3 in Marvel, too. They got like 23 movies, 8 short films, and lots of shows in the Infinity Saga. Star Wars has 12 movies, and that's if you count the animated entry of the 2008 Dave Filoni directed Star Wars The Clone Wars movie. There is a Disney Plus suggested order for Star Wars. But most people fall into two camps. You either watch the movies in order of release or in chronological event order. Whether you include the animated one, that's up to you. If you watch in release order, I think that's the best way to go. I think you get the best representation of not just the evolution of the story as George Lucas created it, but also the evolution of technology that was used to make the movies. So, starting with the original Star Wars, now called New Hope, you move to The Empire Strikes Back, then The Return of the Jedi. That's a good way to get someone who has never seen Star Wars acclimated. I then suggest you go back in time and you watch The Phantom Menace, Attack of the Clones, and maybe the movie, Clone Wars, and then Revenge of the Sith. Then you could complete your journey by watching Solo and Rogue One. Then I might go back and rewatch episodes 4, 5, and 6. What about the sequels? Well, that's a good question. I'm not one of those people who say unequivocally they're not canon. I mean, that's ridiculous. Disney has control over that. But I will say, I was truly excited when The Force Awakens was announced, and I liked the movie a lot. It coincided with a period in my life where I found Jedi Council. It's a YouTube show that you can still find episodes of, and it discussed the movies, news about the movies. It was in great detail. I watched almost every episode with Christian Darth Harloff and Mark II D2 Ellis and Obi-Wan Kenobi Campea. I was heavily invested in every piece of news that was coming out. I've talked about it on past podcasts, but I was extremely excited going into the theater for episode 8. My wife had just had my youngest child, only about a month before the movie, so my dad joined me. That was a great day for me. I'll never forget the mood shift, though, in that AMC theater during the first few moments of the movie. The humor just wasn't landing with anyone, and almost every person in the theater was either silent in shock or they were groaning in disgust. There was a long line coming in for the next showing when we were walking out, and people were shouting, "It sucked!" on the way out. What a depressing thing that must have been for people who were going in to watch the movie. I remember telling my wife that during the movie, I was just trying to make excuses for myself that, hey, it could get better. It could get better. Just hang in there. I thought about it a long time. I went back and watched the movie with a friend a couple of months later, or maybe a month later in Gainesville, and I didn't like it then either. I don't think 8 has any value in the franchise. I really think you could just cut it out completely. And then 9 wasn't that great, but I view that as an attempt to heal the hurt that was caused by 8. My personal opinion is that episode 8 is not just a bad Star Wars movie, but a bad movie all around, especially if you consider that there's no continuity really. And you could disagree with me if you want, but my official recommendation, This Is the Way podcast, recommends you skip 8 and 9, at least for now. They're on the timeline, but I don't think you need to watch them. Until Lucasfilm continues the story with Rey in the announced, but still unwritten, new Jedi Order movie set to be directed by Sharmeen Obaid Chinoy, I don't think you need to find out what happens in the last 3 movies. Even The Force Awakens, which I mentioned, I like. And if you watch 1, you're probably going to watch all 3. And I won't judge you if you do. I just might think less of your opinions about Star Wars if you disagree with me about The Last Jedi. But I imagine that goes both ways.
I have waited a long time for this moment.
Okay, we've talked about just the movies now. Now, if you watch episodes 4, 5, and 6, The Phantom Menace, Attack of the Clones, 1, 2, and the Clone Wars movie, and then episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, you can go back into the original trilogy for a rewatch. Solo, Rogue One, back into the new, the original trilogy. You will have a new appreciation for what took place in A New Hope and The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. You can stop there, or you can move on to the sequels, or before moving on to the original trilogy again, you can include those more recent live-action movies of Solo and Rogue One. And if you're going to skip one of those, I would suggest you make it Solo. Now, it takes place maybe 10 years before A New Hope. Maybe 10 years after Revenge of the Sith. I'm not entirely sure, but if you're going to skip one of those, make it Solo. Because I really think the scene with Vader at the end of Rogue One makes that the movie that's unmissable. Tony Gilroy's Andor, which we will address later, has enhanced that movie of Rogue One. And I don't know how you can truly say often that a series that follows a movie really enhances the show, but I really feel like Andor is really, really well done television. And season 2 is going to lead directly into that movie, Rogue One. It is absolutely an amazing show, in my opinion. And I know we're not talking about the show right now, but the Rogue One is great. Solo's not bad. I just think I'm at a disadvantage when it comes to watching an actor other than Harrison Ford playing Han Solo. I mean, I watched the original trilogy so many times growing up. It's a doomed prospect almost. Hoping to see anyone else in that role, it's hopeless. But yet, I do admit, Donald Glover as Lando Calrissian felt right to me. So maybe it's something else. I don't know. But watch those movies after the original 3 and after the prequels. It feels like the right course of action to lead into heading into the sequels, if you're just watching the movies.
Very well.
This podcast, This Is the Way podcast, is a movie and show only podcast, although I do sometimes talk about some of the things that have happened in novelizations or in books. I'm not suggesting that you don't read at all and that you can't like the comics. In fact, I read Rogue One Catalyst, Lost Stars, Leia, Princess of Alderaan. I liked them all. But the canon pecking order, what is official in the Star Wars timeline and universe, movies first. And the saga is the gold standard. So episodes 1 through 9 are whatever happens on screen, you can take it to the bank. That is what happened in the Star Wars universe. Then the other movies, of course, are right along with them. If you had to, it would be like a 1B or, a 1.1. But the live action shows are second. So if there is a contradiction, which I can't recall one, in a live action show and then a movie, the movie takes precedence. Whatever happened in the movie is canon compared to what happened in the shows. But live action shows would be second. Animation, probably a distant third, although I don't know if you consider novelizations and animation to be almost tied, but novelizations, and by that I don't mean a book related to the movie. I mean a book that is taking place, the events that are in the book take place in the movies. Now, there are differences between the novelization of, say, the Revenge of the Sith and the movie. The movie is what takes precedence. Now, if there's stuff that's in between that fills in the cracks, so to speak, those can be included. But if there's any differences, you rely on movies first, live action shows second, animation third, then novelizations. And then you would go into the standalone novels, Lost Stars, Princess of Alderaan, Rogue One Catalyst. If it happens in those books, then you could also consider it canon. I don't even know if you would count comics. But things like the High Republic series, those are considered to be canon. There are a few movies that are in development at this point that will join the 12 already available in canon pecking order, right, like at the top of the list. There's a movie in development that would probably end up being the very first thing on any Star Wars timeline. And we're talking way before The Phantom Menace. Disney and Lucasfilm intend to make a movie about the first Jedi. At least that's what we've heard. James Mangold is set to direct, and Beau Willimon, who worked on Andor, is writing the script. The last thing on the Star Wars timeline would be another movie in development. This would follow Rey as she creates a new Jedi Order well after the events of Rise of Skywalker, and is the previously mentioned movie that I talked about being directed by Sharmeen Obaid Chinoy. Recently, a new writer was brought on, George Nolfi. It's not the next thing coming out, though. That would be the Mandalorian and Grogu movie. It's finished filming. I think it's in post-production, and it's got a release set for May of 2026. On the timeline, it would be after the events of Return of the Jedi, but before The Force Awakens. Originally, I think it was sold as tying up all the loose ends from series like The Mandalorian, The Book of Boba Fett, Ahsoka, and then once upon a time, Rangers of the New Republic. Probably a good time to mention that I'm talking about these movies as if they're going to be made, but only The Mandalorian and Grogu has been shot. The other two have been announced, but many movies have been announced and then not panned out. Now, The Mandalorian and Grogu may end up just feeling like an extra long 1-episode season 4. But if we're going to talk about series, we should talk about all of them.
Let's get to it.
So, thinking about the watch order again, I think original trilogy, you go back to the prequels, maybe you include Attack of the Clones movie, Solo, Rogue One, back through the original trilogy again. You could start watching television, though, animated or otherwise. Now remember, some shows predated Disney Plus, like Rebels and the Clone Wars animated series. Those were like Disney XD or something. I can't remember. Not Disney Junior, but since 2019, it's Disney Plus that has been doing the releasing of the shows that's produced by Lucasfilm. And news about the first one that was going to be on Disney Plus, it debuted the same day that the service did. It excited me so much that summer that I committed to 3 years of the service before I even knew what was going to be on it. I also started thinking about creating my own Jedi Council. I asked a friend, Tim, hey, do you want a podcast about this with me? This was 2 years after The Last Jedi, if you recall. The Mandalorian's premiere episode, ending with that reveal of the child, that was something that generated a lot of talk. And not just in Star Wars circles. I mean, that was the thing in pop culture at that time. One of the big selling points to me about this show, when I heard about it, hey, it's really close to the events of Return of the Jedi. Now, I mean, it was like 5 years after it, but it wasn't just the time period, though. It wasn't just in proximity to something I loved. I felt Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni captured an aesthetic of Star Wars that I really was craving that I didn't get in those first two movies of the sequel trilogy. The Mandalorian's first 2 seasons are terrific. Season 3 isn't unwatchable. It's just, there are so many live-action Disney Plus shows now that I think, comparatively, seasons 1 and 2 are much better than 3. And there is a series that even takes us to a brand new galaxy, if you recall, with Peridia being outside our prime galaxy, far, far away. But let's start with the first series on the timeline. And I will also start with a This Is the Way podcast official recommendation to skip The Acolyte. Now, this show is set before The Phantom Menace, and it's not going to get a second season. The writing and acting in season 1 are just terrible. I don't know if there's anything good I can say about this show. I know that it has diehard fans, but I cannot recommend you watch this show. It takes place during the High Republic era, which predates even the Phantom Menace in the timeline, but only about 100 years or so. It is considered canon, and we supposedly see Darth Plagueis, Emperor Palpatine's master, in the show. So this officially happens in the same universe that the original trilogy of movies is set. We also see Yoda at the end. Now, were it my decision, I'd pull a Woolo on this and have Disney write this off as a loss and remove it and never show it again. If you don't know, there was a Willow series that was imagined that followed the events of the cult classic Lucasfilm movie from the 80s, or maybe it was the 90s. I think it was the late 80s. But the series produced for Disney Plus was so bad, they removed it from Disney Plus. You cannot watch this show anymore. It was that bad that they took a tax write-off by just saying we're removing it. Now, I don't have that power, but I would do that to The Acolyte and The Last Jedi if I could. That's how bad I think those shows negatively affect Star Wars in my mind. But we're talking about the timeline. We're just talking shows. So this is an appropriate time to mention that when Disney bought Star Wars from George Lucas, they wiped away the inclusion of all the books of what are now called legends. So we're talking shows here, but the Legends material was basically sanctioned fan fiction. I mean, these were novels, but I bet a lot of people prefer some of the stories that were told there, like Heir to the Empire, over The Acolyte. But nothing in the Legends novels counts unless, as Disney and Lucasfilm produce new shows, they end up using characters in newly created content, movies, TV, live action, or animated. And that's great because so far they've chosen well. They pick the good things, like Grand Admiral Thrawn, and then they strip away the bad, like Chewbacca being killed by a moon crashing into a planet.
Uh-oh. It's not good.
The reason I bring up the Legends is because Lucasfilm is sanctioning novels that are set in the High Republic era. They have 15 of them so far, but I doubt any of those books are going to get made into shows after the business failure of The Acolyte. You may like the show, but you cannot wish that it wasn't a failure. It was. Too much money spent, not enough interest, no matter what Luminate, the TV ratings company, mentions about the viewership. It doesn't matter. If it made money, Disney would keep it around. It canceled it. It wasn't making enough money. On the timeline, however, after Mangold's movie, the next show or movie in the timeline is The Acolyte. It counts. This is the way podcast's official recommendation is, again, skip that show. Next on the timeline is The Phantom Menace, followed by Attack of the Clones. You could watch Tales of the Jedi here, which shows Count Dooku's turn and some of the events of Ahsoka's life outside the Order. But you might want to skip the Ahsoka ones, and you might want to skip Count Dooku's until after Attack of the Clones. And, you might want to actually skip it until after the Clone Wars animated series. But on the timeline, I think that's about where it falls. There's the animated movie of the Attack of the Clone Wars, and then there's the series of Clone Wars, which you watch after Attack of the Clones. And you could probably watch Tales of the Empire on Disney+, which shows Morgan Elsbeth and Grand Admiral Thrawn, also Barriss Offee. Elsbeth we meet in The Mandalorian Season 2. She's also in Ahsoka, along with Grand Admiral Thrawn, who we meet in Rebels and Ahsoka. But the stories that are being told take place around this time period. Barriss Offee, that was a character from the Tartarovsky Clone Wars miniseries that's later brought back for a pivotal arc in the Clone Wars animated series. And you have to make a decision, though, because some of the events take place after Revenge of the Sith on the timeline. Some of the events take place before Attack of the Clones, so it's tricky. There are things that happen in later seasons of the Clone Wars series that also take place after Revenge of the Sith. Just barely. But, this is when they fall on the timeline, approximately. Since some of the Tales of the Empire and Clone Wars and the entirety of the Bad Batch take place after Revenge of the Sith, I would watch Revenge of the Sith before those shows. Even though some of the events take place before and after. I mean, the Bad Batch, I think it starts right at Order 66. So you have Revenge of the Sith, and then the Bad Batch, and then you get to Solo, and then you have Obi-Wan Kenobi. I liked a lot about that show, including the live-action young Leia. But then there's that trench coat scene. And if you've seen the show, you know what I'm talking about. Probably the worst lightsaber stabbing survivals of the series. Ridiculous. The last Kenobi and Vader fight, that is terrific. But the setup was terrible. It was an afterthought. I mean, how he's allowed to just go down to the surface of... It's really bad. The Seventh Sister stuff on Tatooine, it's unwatchable, in my opinion. That whole part of the story just really ruins the show. I mean, I do not recommend the show at all. But it's not even close to being as bad as The Acolyte. That's much more acceptable in my eyes to accept Obi-Wan Kenobi than it is to accept The Acolyte.
Yeah, you're probably right.
Following Obi-Wan Kenobi is technically Andor, or at least the first season, which is available now. Andor's first season takes place 5 years before A New Hope and Rogue One. The second season, though, which is available in April of 2025, has 4 separate story arcs, each representing a year's time leading up to Rogue One. Rebels, however, is an animated series that also takes place during that time span. We don't hear about events on Ferrix in Rebels or Lothal yet in Andor, so there's really no overlap between those two shows. So if you had to choose, I would say watch Rebels first before you started Andor, because then you could watch all of Andor leading right up to Rogue One, which leads right into A New Hope, and those are next on the timeline. And I think you watch Andor, Rogue One, and then A New Hope. That, to me, feels like a really good string of shows. Mercifully, no one has attempted to do anything inside the years between the first and second Death Star explosions yet. I mean, it's a clean run through those movies on the timeline until we get to The Mandalorian.
This is the way. This is the way.
Ah, The Mandalorian. It's set 9 years after the Battle of Yavin, or the first Death Star destruction. So 5 or so years after the Battle of Endor. Seasons 1 and 2 gave us, 16 episodes of enjoyable Star Wars? Memes, catchphrases, Luke wielding a lightsaber and the Force like so many of us had dreamed growing up. Now, in a way, the Book of Boba Fett series starts much closer to Return of the Jedi because he crawls out of the Sarlacc pit, but so much of the show takes place well after The Mandalorian, at least seasons 1 and 2. Indeed, events of the second season of that show lead into the Book of Boba Fett. You shouldn't watch Boba Fett before you watch The Mandalorian, even though the beginning does take place so soon after Return of the Jedi. But you should take a break after season 2 of The Mandalorian to watch Book of Boba Fett before you continue with season 3 of The Mandalorian. People have problems with the Book of Boba Fett too. I did as well. But it kind of is Mandalorian season 2.5. It's kind of a continuation of The Mandalorian. It's not clear, but my research tells me that after season 3 of The Mandalorian, then Ahsoka takes place. Now, we know that Ahsoka has to come after The Mandalorian, but it's not very clear when everything takes place because Ahsoka comes next on the timeline. We know how season 1 leaves off, so I would watch The Mandalorian season 1, season 2, The Book of Boba Fett season 1, and I don't think there's going to be a second, season 3 of The Mandalorian, and then Ahsoka season 1, and then eventually season 2. Then, on the timeline, would be Skeleton Crew, and that's primarily based on what we've been told by the creators. There's nothing in the shows that we've seen specifically that points to it being the last live-action show, but since there's no overlap, we can't be sure, and we just have to go based on what they said. The Mandalorian and Grogu movie may give us some insight on that, especially if we hear it's set after 9 ABY, after the Battle of Yavin, since The Mandalorian, The Book of Boba Fett, Ahsoka, and Skeleton Crew, they're all supposed to take place around 5 years after the Emperor's fall. Alright, so we're done with the timeline, right? Well, we don't know where season 2 is going to fall. I mean, it could just be an immediate follow-up to season 1, or there could be some time elapsed. Season 2 of Ahsoka may or may not stay in that same time period. And with the way things go in the other universe and with the world between worlds and things, we don't know what's going to happen. But the next show after that would be the last series taking place before the sequel trilogy, Star Wars Resistance, an animated show It begins around 6 months or so before The Force Awakens. And then it continues into The Last Jedi and then leads up to The Rise of Skywalker. This is another show I don't recommend. But it's not because it's really bad. I don't think it's of the same quality as even Rebels. If you're looking for what happens on the timeline, that it would be Resistance, then The Force Awakens, The Last Jedi, leading into The Rise of Skywalker, and then the last thing on the timeline that we know of that's supposed to come is the new Jedi Order movie, and that would be the end of the current Star Wars timeline, at least until something new is created. So if you're a casual Star Wars fan, skip the animated shows, even the better ones. It's not for quality, but the animated shows are most definitely targeted at a younger audience. So if you're an adult and a casual fan, evaluate your love for Star Wars first in the live action series and movies, and then decide if you want to make it through some of the harder to get through episodes that all of the animated series have from time to time. I mean, if you love everything Star Wars, there are some really good episodes made in animation. Some of the animated shows give really interesting context to some of the movies and live action shows that I think enhance my enjoyment of Star Wars. But there's also some episodes that left me cringing.
I fit perfectly in this wonderful, beautiful No, go away. I was so happy.
And I would also recommend skipping The Acolyte. Again, if you're going to skip one live action series, skip The Acolyte. And if you're going to skip one live action movie, skip The Last Jedi. You could maybe skip Rise of Skywalker, but Episode 7 doesn't match the tone of the other films. And if you go back and listen to the discourse in the fandom, say on a show like Collider Jedi Council right after the movie was released,
this fan reaction that seems to be so divisive right off the bat, because even Thursday night you saw a lot of things coming out from fans saying that they loved it or this is the worst Star Wars movie ever. The big thing that stands out to everybody is the 56% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes versus the 93% score from critics.
I can't tell you how many tweets I got. This exact tweet. I hated it. Worst Star Wars movie ever. I'll tweet you back and let you know if I liked it the second time. There are choices that are made in this movie that hardcore Star Wars fans are going to hate. And they have. They've hated it. And I think that the hardcore, passionate Star Wars fans, the fans, to be quite honest, that watch Jedi Council every week, those the fans that are really just inside of the lore, I think a lot of them, it didn't land for them. There are those fans that are hardcore Star Wars fans that didn't like. I think most of casual fans enjoy this movie. I could be wrong, but we'll see.
You go back in time, 5, 9, I don't know how many years ago when the movies were released, and then you listen to how people talked about it. I think there's evidence that this movie caused a great schism in the fandom. And it took years to heal the divide that the prequels had caused to some fans. This is the way Podcast's official recommendation is to start with the 1977 movie that started it all. If you like episodes 4, 5, and 6, well then give 1, 2, and 3 a try. Then maybe Rogue One or the series Andor and The Mandalorian. Now if you've got a young family, try Skeleton Crew. If you like The Mandalorian, well, go to the Book of Boba Fett after season 2. Ahsoka's not bad, so you include that. Then try Solo. Maybe work in some Rebels and the Clone Wars series and the Clone Wars movie. So if you already love Star Wars, try branching out with some of those, and then now you know where they appear, right, on the timeline. Try some animation. Refer to this podcast if you want to know when it's taking place. I hope this podcast episode has been helpful. I imagine if you're just hearing it only, it's going to be hard to follow, but you can find visual timelines on many different fan sites, including the unfortunately political Wikipedia. I've worked all week on getting graphics made, but I'm not an expert, so I don't know how they're going to look. If you have enjoyed this time listening, please consider subscribing, liking the episode, and come back for future episodes. If you're starting on The Mandalorian, you might dare to check out our past podcast episodes on the show. any of the shows that have been released except for The Acolyte, you can probably find at least a recap and discussion episode. You can send in thoughts about this episode or anything Star Wars related to thisisthewaypodcast@gmail.com. We have social media handles on places like Instagram, X, Twitch, @thisisthewaypod, and you can find links on our Linktree site, linktr.ee.com/thisisthewaypod. Thank you for observing Star Wars Podcast Day 2025 with us. And if you love Star Wars, there are several other podcasters doing so as well. Thank you to Holly J for the suggestion for this episode, and our next scheduled podcast is going to come at the end of February with another news update episode. We'll do the same for March, maybe April, and then Andor Season 2 comes out at the end of the month. And please stay tuned for all of that. I'm Steve Lascauso, and you just listened to This Is The Way podcast. May the Force be with you, always.